Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is the Better Sweater series. This is installment number 4, and today we're going to talk about pattern writing, note-taking, and we're going to talk about necklines. If you're new to the Better Sweater series, welcome. I'd encourage you to go back and check out the first 3 installments in the series where we talk about design considerations, yarn choices, sweater math, swatching, all that kind of good stuff. And that'll bring you up to date. Now, the Better Sweater series is meant to accompany our remake along for 2018, and that remake along is very basically a little bit of encouragement to go into our closets, pull out sweaters from big box stores that don't quite fit us, or sweaters from our mothers or our grandmothers that we love but they're getting worn thin, and remake them into something that we truly love and will want to wear. So I've been, as you know if you've been following the series, I'm planning on remaking this sweater, which is a big box store cable-fronted cotton sweater. It's kind of in a cotton acrylic blend, and I'm planning on remaking it in wool. And in the last installment I talked all about measuring the sweater, measuring your body, and measuring your swatch for all the numbers that you're going to need to put together your actual pattern. So what I did in the interim, since I've seen you last, is I started writing up my pattern and started knitting my sweater. So as far as pattern writing goes, I have a few general suggestions. Then I have some specifics about this sweater that I'm working on and my pattern, and that includes some design choices and some things that I'm going to change now as I write up the final pattern. So, for reference, I think you can see the sweater, but I'm going to bring it a little bit closer to the camera so that you can see the cable front of the whole thing. And it has a couple of 3x3 crosses here and here. It has a 5x5 kind of cross in the center, and it's kind of nicely symmetrical in that it has the 5x5, 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 and then the 2 3s here. The back is just a plain stockinette. And the sleeves and the yoke, it's all a raglan construction up here. So as far as pattern writing goes, I have a few general suggestions, and then I have some specifics about the actual sweater that I'm working on and the pattern that I've written up, including some design choices I made to change the sweater and some things that I would change now that I've started knitting the sweater for the actual writing of the final pattern. Okay, so in general, pattern construction is something that I would really suggest you do at once. You kind of sit down, you have your design in mind, you have your sketches and your swatches and all of your numbers, and you're going to go through the actual pattern construction. When I say do it all at once, I mean don't leave, don't say to yourself, well, I'll leave that yoke math until I get there. I would really suggest when you sit down to write your pattern that you just push yourself through. If you're going bottom up, top down, whatever it is, don't just write the first part of the pattern and then start knitting. Write the first part of the pattern with the cast on, write the part about the ribbing, write the part about how you're going to do all of your cables and your increases and your decreases for sizing, how you're going to do your yoke, what you're going to do with your sleeves. Write out as much of it as you possibly can in that first sitting. And I say that because if you just write out a little bit of your pattern and then start knitting it, you may have to go away from it for a while, or you may have to set it down, as I've had to with my sweater pattern for a sample knit that I'm working on. And it's really important to have good notes for yourself when you come back to that project. And the more you can write up now in that one moment that you sit down and actually get the math done, the better off you're going to be. Now that doesn't mean your pattern won't change. So as I started knitting my sweater from the pattern that I had written, I did change some things in the actual knitting of the sweater, and that's okay. Just then keep notes for yourself. So let me show you, and what I'll do is throughout this video I'll insert some photos and some other things about patterns rather than holding everything up to the camera, but I'm going to hold a few things up to the camera. So this is my initial pattern, and you can see I'm keeping notes for myself as I go, things that I've changed, actual stitch counts here for certain parts of the cables that I needed to keep track of. I do have a couple of highlighted places in the pattern where I think I need to change something, but I'm not quite sure. But the pattern is written out fully. So I have my needle size, my gauge, how my body is going to be shaped. I have my sleeves and I have my yoke construction. all ready to go. And then what I'm doing is knitting from my pattern to see if it actually works. Now this is something that I heard, I think it was Kefren Pritchett of Kefren Knitting Studio write about in one of her blog posts or on Instagram somewhere. She said that when she writes a pattern, she often writes the pattern and then knits from it as if she's knitting a test of the pattern, right? And I think that really makes sense to me. There are, as you write your pattern, if you're thinking about using it just for yourself, then sure, keep your notes. They'll always come in handy in the future. But if you're thinking about writing your pattern and sharing it or selling it, there are a few things to keep in mind. There are some templates online that you can use that'll tell you some of the basic elements of a pattern that you want to make sure you include. You could also look to some of your favorite patterns that you already have, see what's included, what they do that you like, what they do that you think is really successful and helpful to you as a knitter, and then kind of think about how to incorporate those kinds of ideas in your own pattern. There's also a great book by Kate Atherley called Pattern Writing for Knit Designers, which I would recommend. It's not too expensive, and she is a tech knitter for Knitty Magazine, and she knows what she's talking about, and she will give you all of the little tips and tricks that you might need for pattern writing for commercial use or for others. So in addition to all of those resources, there are also like sizing charts, standard sizing charts that you can use if you're going to try to scale your pattern, and we'll talk about that a little in another installment of this series. And that includes things like setting up a spreadsheet so that you can input different measurements, input your gauge, and then have the computer do the work for you of the sweater math. Okay, so all of that aside, the big takeaway point, I think, at the beginning of this is if you're going to write up a pattern, do it at once. Try to get your whole pattern written up so that you can knit from it and make changes as you go based on your actual knitting. Now, what I did is just that. I showed you my pattern that I worked up, and then I started knitting it. And I can't get it on the model because I don't have it on waist yarn at the moment. So I'll try to hold it up and talk about it at the same time. So this is my sweater. And you can see that the nice thing is this light colored wool, it's a 3-ply, really brings out the cables, which I love being able to see. You can see the sweater as it was. It's really, even in this light, it's difficult to see all the cables. I think I'm trying to look on the camera to see it. I don't know that you can make them out all that well. But once you do this in a light woolen yarn, or wool yarn, you can definitely see what's going on here. Okay, so things that I kept and things that I didn't. I kept the symmetry here, so I do have the 5 cable cross here, here, and here, and in the center I have those 3x3 cable crosses. Now, I didn't replicate exactly what's going on in the sweater, and I will put a picture in here of the two side by side so that you can see some of the differences. These are cable patterns that I found in Cable Left, Cable Right, which is a really great stitch dictionary for cablers. And so I've used those patterns, those charts, to be able to knit up this sweater. And I'd like, in this pattern, once I put it all together, I'd like to kind of insert charts so that you'd be able to see what's going on with the cables. Now, some choices that I made by the numbers, and I'll show you my pattern either in this video, like I said, or I'll do a separate blog post so you can see the actual pattern as it's evolving. But by the numbers, this ended up being a bottom-up sweater construction, and I did it in the round, and the back is still the reverse stockinette stitch, which I'm not sure I'd totally recommend because it's very painful on my hands to be doing this. But I did it in the round, and I chose to cast on, I used my gauge swatch and my body measurements to figure out my number of cast on stitches for my size, for the number of inches that I am around the hips. And I chose to, if you think about this as a big circle, right, I chose to have more stitches on the front than in the back because of my cables. What that means basically is once I got to the end of the ribbing, I knew I would need to increase into my cables, because if I just cast on the number of stitches that I needed for my cables down below, it would end up being a really poofy sweater because the number of stitches I need for the cables is greater to get the same gauge as than the number of stitches I needed to cast onto the ribbing. Now this was triply complicated by the fact that ribbing it cinches things in, as do cables, but it cinches them in a different way than cables do. So one of the choices I made was that when I moved from my ribbing to my main sweater, I did all of my increasing for my cables on the front. So the front panel, front half of the sweater has proportionally more stitches than the back of the sweater to be able to cover the same number of inches around. And there was a little bit of a complication. One of the other things I wanted to do design-wise was to make sure that my cables kind of grew out of my ribbing, and I think you can see that there. I can hold it up here a little bit closer. I wanted to make sure that my ribbing didn't just end in a purl row, but that it actually kind of grows up into the cables, and I think you can see that successfully happened there. Now to do that, I needed to do simultaneously my increases from the ribbing to the cables and work the pattern. So the setup row for the pattern. So that was one of the harder elements to work into the actual pattern writing, and something that I'll need to go back into my pattern and clarify a little bit for the final version. But it makes for a really nice sweater. It makes for a nice kind of ribbing, and there's not going to be any squinch or splay with the cables. This won't pop out or be kind of puckered in any kind of way because of that ribbing or the cables. So that was one choice I made. And I decided to do a little bit of waist shaping on this. So they're in this stockinette portion that is on the side of the sweater, right next to the cables. This is where I do all of my shaping. So waist shaping happens here. And I decided in my pattern, I had written it out so that I would decrease, I think, 5 stitches and then increase 5 stitches. So decrease in and then increase out to the bust. When I was actually working the pattern, I found that I tried this on and I thought, I don't want to decrease it anymore. I want this to have a little bit more ease in it. We talked about ease last time. Ease is that extra, bit of play that your fabric has. So if you were to take your body measurement and then knit exactly to your body measurement, you'd have a form-fitting sweater. If you take your body measurement and your gauge and you give it an inch or two on either side, you're probably going to be happier with the sweater. So as I was doing the waist shaping, I realized I didn't want to shape it in any further. I wanted to leave a little bit of extra ease. And so I will change that in the final pattern that I write up. So those are some of the choices that I made. And I talked last time about the other important choice, which is how much to increase from your cables up to your ribbing, and to avoid the squinch and splay problem. And that ratio, if you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can go back to installment number 3, which is all about gauges and sweater measurements and things like that. So those were the choices I made in terms of the numbers as I was trying to work on this sweater pattern. The other big choices I had to make have to do with the sleeves and the yoke. So this sweater, I'm going to stop holding this guy up for a minute. This sweater has a classic raglan sleeve, which is just a kind of straight line from the armpit and the bust all the way up to the neckline. And that can be really flattering on some people, and on some people it's either not flattering or not comfortable, in part because the decreases happen all at once and it can get kind of bunchy and not feel as comfortable. Depends on who you are, right? So I decided to look into raglan shaping a little bit to see what other options were available. And there are a few different options available. And I'm going to pull out Jennifer Wood's book here to give you a sense. She's one of the designers that really plays around not only with raglan, but with compound raglan, which is what I decided to do. So here is a sweater, and I'm not sure you'll be able to actually see it too much. This is Corrine, and this sweater has a compound raglan in the sleeve. It's going to be a little hard to see. And this is from Jennifer Wood's Refined Knits book, which is a brilliant cable and lace pattern book. But a compound raglan, very basically, instead of just going straight up decreases, it decreases rapidly in this armpit area, then decreases less rapidly in this next area, and then decreases rapidly again. So you end up with a kind of S shape to your raglan. The cool thing about that is, or one of the cool things about that, is that a lot of people say that it looks and functions much more like a set-in sleeve, even though the construction is still a raglan, where you're working the yoke all the way around in a circle. So the cool thing is that it functions like a set-in sleeve, but you're not actually setting in a sleeve. You're still doing a raglan decrease construction. So that's what I'm going to do with my sweater pattern. And one of the things I had to figure out was the distance between here and here. And on me, for the purpose of my sweater, it's about 7 inches, which given my gauge means I have about 50 rows to get from the join of the body and the 2 sleeves for the yoke all the way up to where I'm going to do the collar. So every move that I make in trying to figure out how I'm going to do my arm shaping, my armhole shaping, and my neck shaping has to be within those 50 rows. That led to a lot of sweater math, trying to figure out exactly how to do these decreases, how fast, where, how many rows are going to be covered, etc., etc. So that's one thing I had to figure out for the pattern. And one way to do that, as I've said before, is to look at other patterns, to look at kind of design standards about sizing and decreasing, and those things can all help you out. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to necklines in a minute. The other thing I decided to do, because I like to have short rows in my sweaters, and you guys know this from following along on the podcast very likely, is that once I got up to closer to the neckline, I decided that I wanted to incorporate short rows into the raglan shaping. Now that's something that is a little bit trickier to find notes for, to figure out exactly how to do it, but Pearl Soho has a great pattern that I will link to in the show notes, where they have a raglan, a plain raglan, that they end up doing some short row shaping on the back for. And I think this actually is a technique that others have used as well. Once you've joined the yoke and you're working around and around and around, you get to this point where you set your neck stitches on a holder, and then you just start working back and forth. Let's see if I can lower this guy in a kind of horseshoe shape. We're going to talk about necklines anyway, so I'll decrease this guy down. So you work back and forth from here to here around the back, doing your short row shaping while you're also doing your raglan shaping. What that allows for is for the back of your sweater to sit higher than the front of your sweater, and you complete the rest of your decreases while these neckline stitches sit on a stitch holder, so that they're not going to be bound off, they're not going to be too tight. They'll just sit as nice live stitches, so that when you come back and you want to join everything up and put your collar on, you're ready to go. So those were 2 design choices that I made, and I made them early on. Like I said, it's really important to sit down and write out your pattern as you imagine it in kind of one fell swoop, and then as you go through actually knitting the sweater, you make your changes and test things out and see what you actually like as the fabric is forming in front of you. 2 things I would change so far about my sweater. I'll just say for perpetuity, I'll tell you guys now. One is the cast on edge. I used an alternating cable cast on for the edge, which I really love because it's very stretchy, right? For a nice sweater with ribbing, I want to have that kind of stretch on my sweater. I really don't like cast-ons that bind up the fabric, and I don't like bind-offs that kind of bind up the fabric. They have their use structurally, but for a lot of times what you want is an actual kind of stretchy, a little bit stretchy of a bind-off or a cast-on. So I have this alternating cable cast-on, which I like very much, and it leads very well into the ribbing. But having worked on this sample knit, it's a Foundry scarf by Jared Flood of Brooklyn Tweed. He does a beautiful tubular cast on, and I had heard a lot about the tubular cast on, but I haven't ever done it or used it. But it's brilliant, and I would totally use a tubular cast on for the bottom of a sweater or for cuffs, mostly because it leaves a really incredibly finished edge, and it's super stretchy, but not, it still has structure to it, and it still has elasticity and memory. So I think for this pattern, I would recommend either this alternating cable cast on, or if you wanted to, a tubular cast on. So the pattern hopefully will include instructions on how to do that. The other thing I would change is, you can see with this sweater, that I think you can see that this sweater it's a big box store sweater, so it was knit by machines, etc. But it seamed, and so it has this seam running down the side. Now I decided to work in the round, but because structurally it's all I have is one front panel of cable, so it's not like an all-over cable design. I think it'll be okay structurally. But what I would have included, or what I will include in the pattern, is a knit stitch running down the side to kind of mimic a seam. And adding a knit stitch not only mimics a seam, but it does offer a little bit of extra structure. As it stands, I think it's fine. It just would be really nice if it had a kind of visual marker for where the sides of the sweater should be. So those are two things I would change so far. And the lucky thing is I have my pattern written up, so all I have to do to make those changes is add in those things that I would like to maybe swap out or offer as an alternate for whoever was knitting the sweater. Okay, so that's the quick primer on pattern writing and some of my tips and suggestions for you and some of my experiences writing this pattern up. Once I get it written up, I do plan to make it available for anyone else who's interested in trying to knit a version of this sweater in a different size. And so that'll be a fun kind of test run on a design for you all. But the other thing I wanted to talk about today is neck shaping. And Ida of the Knitting Pace podcast, who happens to be in Aarhus, Denmark, which is one of my I love Aarhus, Denmark. It's one of the places that I happen to have spent a lot of time because I was doing some research there for about 5 years, on and off. I was in the city. So Ida and I have talked a little bit about Aarhus, and it's nice to hear from her. But she wrote in and said, will you talk about necklines at all in this series? So I thought I'd give a very brief kind of primer about necklines and send you guys on your way with some resources so that you can go check out some other instructions about necklines. So let's talk about necklines. I would first point you to Amy Herzog's blog, where she has a great tutorial about the different kinds of necklines. And I'm going to give you just a quick run through here. There's some basic kinds of necklines. There's like a V-neck, there's a round neck, which is this guy, a square neck, and a boat neck. Those are kind of like what Amy Herzog identifies as kind of the basic necklines. And each of those necklines, she says, allows you to build up different kinds of collars and different kinds of finishing for your sweater. So she talks about a round neckline allowing for things like a crew neck or a hood, or a funnel neck or a turtleneck, and all those kinds of rounded necks, whether they're big and turtleneck or funnel-y, or whether they're kind of low and crew. This kind of round neck is a kind of staple neck design. The V-neck we all know about, and V-necks allow for things like shawl collars, depending on, square necks allow for them as well. Square necks allow for kind of Henley collars or shawl collars. And I've done a couple sweaters with shawl collars, and I really absolutely love them because you use short row shaping to kind of create this collar that's very tall in the back, but not a lot of fabric in the front. And then there's the classic kind of boat neck, which sits out here usually, and it has a couple of inches, everything's kind of sealed up to a couple of inches, and then it has this kind of low slung but long neckline. And those necklines are all pretty standard. It doesn't mean that you couldn't just invent something completely new, but they tend to be kind of industry standards. A couple of things to think about with necklines and neckline shaping though. If you're doing a square neck, which it really is, like it's usually flat right across here and it goes up this way, you'd use it to do a Henley kind of neckline. Or if you're doing even a round neck, oftentimes you'll be asked to bind off stitches in the front for a square neck or a round neck. And one of the great suggestions that I've seen as I've been looking through a bunch of design books is that, yes, sometimes you want to bind off those stitches depending on structure and, you know, what else is going on in your design. There's never a generalizable never do this or always do this. So there's always exceptions. But you're often asked to either bind off those stitches or to put them on a stitch holder. Now the difference between the two things is pretty important. If you were to bind off stitches for a round neck, that ends up being much closer to the actual head and neck hole. Those stitches can get kind of stiff if they're bound off, especially if they're bound off in a way that isn't stretchy. Whereas if you put them on a holder and then use them and knit with them like as if they were as live stitches, you'll get a stretchier finish on that collar, and it'll allow the person to get the actual sweater over their head a little bit easier. So one tip or suggestion is that if you ever think about the difference between binding off and putting them on stitch holders, you might want to just go with stitch holders, depending on how close that neckline is to somebody's actual head and the hole that you're expecting their head to go through. For my sweater design, I'm going to put my neckline stitches on a stitch holder as I work my short rows in the back, and keep them live in the front so that it'll be a nice stretchy opening for the head to go through. Another thing to think about is, like with a v-neck, I have a v-neck on here, kind of, or with other necklines that kind of, a square neckline would be as well. You'd have a square thing here, and then it would kind of go up. Your decreases go up, and I'll insert some photos here so that you can see what I'm talking about. But the typical way you do that is you set your decreases along the lines of where you're going. So on one side you do a knit two together, and the other side you do a slip knit, or some other version of a left leaning decrease. So that way you have your right leaning decrease and your left leaning decreases, right? But one tip that I've learned is not to do those decreases right on the edge of the fabric. You don't want to do them right here, because it'll lead to this kind of what looks like a very stair-step version of a collar. It would be difficult to pick up stitches for a finishing work for a collar of any kind. It's difficult to, it just doesn't look finished if you were to leave it that way. So the best advice I've seen is, if you're going to do any kind of binding off as you do your decreases for a v-neck or a square neck, is to do those decreases 1 or 2 stitches into the pattern. And like I said, I'll insert some photos here so that you can see the difference. There are a couple really great blogs that show you the difference between doing the decreases directly on the edge and doing the decreases a couple stitches in. And what that does is it leaves your edge stitches to always be these beautiful fine knit stitches, if that's what you're going for. And your decreases just look like a line kind of over here, but it's not messing with the actual edge of your fabric. So that's my second kind of tip for doing your, if you're thinking about necklines and how to do them and how to finish them nicely and beautifully. The last thing I'd say about necklines is, make sure in your pattern writing, or when you're thinking about your neckline, keep in mind that when you start working in this area of the sweater, you're often working on multiple things at once. So even if you're doing a sweater in pieces, you would often be at this point shaping for the armholes and shaping for the neckline at the same time. And so if you're writing up a pattern or if you're reading a pattern or knitting from a pattern, you want to be really sure that you understand what's going on in this area. If you're doing, in the case of this sweater that I'm going to be remaking, I know I'm going to be doing armhole shaping, decreases up to the neckline for the neckline shaping. I'm going to be doing it all at once, and I want to keep that straight so that it's easy enough for me to remember what I'm doing and where I'm doing it. And if I'm going to write this pattern up and share it, I want it to be something that's very clear that we're working on multiple things at once. And you got to be aware of how one thing will affect another, and how much space in terms of rows you actually have to do the work that you need to do to get from your armpit up to your collar, for both your body of your sweater and for your sleeves. So that's a tiny little bit about necklines, and I hope that's helpful. Ida, thanks for the suggestion of throwing that in here. If anybody else has suggestions or questions, things they'd like to see or hear covered, I do my best, so please send them either via email or put them up on the Ravelry Remake Along group, or leave a comment here on YouTube. I'm always happy to hear from you guys. That is about it for today. I've got to get back to fixing up my pattern, and I've got to finish up this body knitting. I think I have about 2 more inches before leaving this aside and working my sleeves up to the armpit so that I can join the whole thing and work on the yoke. So hopefully by installment number 5, you'll see a relatively finished sweater, and we can talk about the next steps in this process. Thanks for tuning in. It was great to see you guys today, and good luck with your sweaters. I want to see your progress over in the Ravelry group, so please start posting, keep posting, and let us know how you're doing. Take care.